Hello, my name is J.M. Frey, and I'm a science fiction and fantasy author and screenwriter. In February of 2017, I had the great pleasure of addressing the Grant MacEwan University English Department with a keynote speech titled, "Your Voice is Valid." In the intervening years, I think the message of my talk has become even more vital for creators, so in the spirit of the great internet masterclasses, I am going to attempt to record this speech for you so I can share it today. Now, I had the great fortune of being able to publish the entirety of the speech in Volume 1 of Blanket Magazine, and I'm going to be reading directly from the magazine today because, let's face it, I no longer have the speech memorized. My friends, I have a declaration to make, a promise, a vow, if you will, and it is this. If I hear one more basement-dwelling troll decry the lead female protagonist of a genre film as a Mary Sue one more time, I am going to scream. I'm sure you've seen this all before. A major science fiction, fantasy, video game, novel, or comic franchise or publisher announces a new title. Said new title features a lead protagonist who is female, or a person of color, or is not able-bodied, or is non-neurotypical, or is LGBTQA2S+. It might be the new Iron Man or Spider-Man, who are both young black teenagers in the comics now, or Lieutenant Michael Burnham of Star Trek Discovery, or the new Ms. Marvel, who is Muslim. It could be Jyn Erso, the female lead of the Star Wars film Rogue One, or Chirrut, her blind companion. It could be the deaf FBI director Gordon Cole from Twin Peaks, or Clint Barton from Fraction and Adge's Hawkeye graphic novel series. It could be Sarah of Dragon Age fame, or Samantha Trainer from Mass Effect, both lesbians, or Dorian, also from Dragon Age, who is both a person of color and flamboyantly queer. Maybe it's Lieutenant Stamets or Dr. Hugh Culber, played by Anthony Rapp and Wilson Cruz, both open-out gay men playing openly out gay men in Star Trek. It could be Captain Christopher Pike, both from the original Star Trek series and the reboot film, who uses a wheelchair and assistive devices to communicate. Or maybe it's Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier, who fights with a prosthetic arm in the comics, or Iron Man, whose suit serves as Tony Stark's egotastic pacemaker. And generally, the audience cheers at the announcement. Yay for diversity! Yay for representation! Yay for working to make the world we consume look more like the world we live in! Yay! But there's a certain segment of the fan population that does not celebrate. I'm sure you know all about what I'm talking about. This certain brand of fan person gets all up in arms on social media. They whine, they complain. They say it's just not appropriate to change the gender, race, sexual orientation, or physical abilities of a fictional creation, or just protest their inclusion to begin with. They decry the erosion of creativity in the service of neoliberalism, overreaching political correctness, and feminazis. Fema alt-right. It's not realistic. Women can't survive in space, they say. It's just a fact. And that, by the way, is a direct quote. Superheroes can't be black, they say. Video game characters shouldn't have a sexual orientation unless it seems the sexual orientation is straight and the game serves to support a male gaze ogling at half-dressed pixelated prostitutes. And strong female characters have to wear boob armor. It's just natural, they say. These fan persons predict the end of civilization because things are no longer being done the way they've always been done. There's nothing wrong with the system, they say, so don't you dare change it. And to enforce this opinion, to ensure that it's really, really clear just how much contempt this certain segment of the fan population holds for any lead protagonist that isn't a white, heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical cis male, they do everything they can to tear them down. And they do this by calling that character a Mary Sue. When fanfiction author Paula Smith first used the term Mary Sue in her 1973 story A Trekkie's Tale, she was making a commentary on the frequent appearance of original characters in Star Trek fanfiction. Now, I'm going to hazard that most of these characters existed as a masturbatory avatar. Want to bone Spock? And let's face it, who didn't? Then write a story where a character representing you gets to bone Spock. And if they weren't a sexual fantasy avatar, then they were an adventure avatar. Want to be an officer on the Enterprise? Well, it's the flagship of the Starfleet, so you better be good enough to get there. Chekhov was the youngest navigator in Starfleet history, Uhura the most tonally sensitive officer in linguistics, and Jim Kirk's genius burned like a magnesium flare. Your self-representative character would have to keep up with them to earn their place on that bridge. This led to a slew of hypersexualized, physically idealized, and unrealistically competent author-based characters populating the fanfiction in the zines at that time. But inserting trumped-up versions of yourself into a narrative wasn't invented in the 1970s. Aeneas was totally Virgil's Mary Sue in the Iliad knockoff. Dante was such a fanboy of the Bible that he wrote a whole story about him getting to explore hell. Robin Hood's Merry Men and King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table kept growing in number and characteristics with each retelling. Even painters have inserted themselves into commissioned pictures throughout history. This isn't new. It's not a recently created human impulse. But what Paula Smith and the Mary Sue writing fanfickers didn't know at the time was that they were crystallizing what it means to be an engaged consumer of media texts instead of just a passive one. They had isolated and labeled what it means to be so affected by a story, to love it so much that this same love bubbles up out of you, and you have to do something about it, either in play or in art. For example, in pretending to be a Ninja Turtle on the playground, or trying to recreate the perfect version of a Starfleet uniform to wear, or creating art and making comics depicting your favorite moments or further adventures of the characters you love, or writing stories that encompass missing moments from the narratives. Mary Sue's are, at their center, a celebration of putting one's self and one's own heart and one's own enjoyment of a media text first. Before I talk about why this certain segment of the fan population deploys the term Mary Sue the way it does, let's take a look at this impulse for participatory play. Here's the $64,000 question. Where do Mary Sues come from? I'd like you to take a moment to think back to the sorts of games you enjoyed when you were about 7 years old. Close your eyes. Picture yourself outside, playing with your siblings or the neighbor's kids or your cousins. What are you doing? Playing ball games, chase games, and probably something with a narrative? Are you Power Rangers? Are you flying to Neverland with Peter Pan? Are you fighting Dementors and Death Eaters at Hogwarts? Are you the newest members of One Direction? Are you Gem and the Holograms or the Misfits? Are you running around collecting Pokemon before, running around collecting Pokemon IRL was actually a thing? That, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, is where Mary Sues come from. That's it. It's just that simple. Okay, open your eyes. As a child, you didn't know that modern literary tradition poo-poos self-analogous characters or that realism was required for depth of character. If you wanted to be a train with Thomas and Friends, then you were a train. If you wanted to be a magic pony from Equestria, you were a pony. Or, if you were trying to appease two separate friends, you were a pony train. Self-insert in childhood games teach kids the concept of elastic play and this essential ability to imagine oneself in skins that are not one's own and to stretch and reshape narratives is what breeds creativity and storytelling, and it is also what shapes compassion. Now, think of your early stories. As a child, we all told and wrote stories about doing what was, to us, mundane, everyday things, like getting ice cream with the fictional characters we know and love. My friend's 3-year-old tells his father bedtime stories about going on walks through Home Hardware with his friends, the anthropomorphized versions of the local taco food truck, and the commuter train his dad takes to work every morning. He doesn't recognize the difference between real and fictional people, or for him, in this case, the stand-ins that are the figures that loom large in his life right now as a 3-year-old who is obsessed with massive machines. When you ask him to tell you a story, he talks about these fictions as if they're real. And he doesn't hesitate to insert himself into the tale. I did this, I did that. We went there, and then we had this for lunch. He is present in all his own stories because, at his age, he understands the world only from his limited personal POV. As we grow up, we do learn to differentiate between fantasy and reality, but I posit that we never really truly lose that, ooh, me too feeling. We see something amazing happening on the screen or on the page or on a playing field, and we want to be there. We want to be a part of that. We sort ourselves into Hogwarts houses. We choose hockey teams to love, and we wear their jerseys. We buy ball caps from our favorite breweries. We line up for hours to be the first to watch a new release or to buy a certain smartphone. We collect stamps and baseball cards and first editions of Jane Austen. Our capitalist consumer society says that we must prove our love with our dollars. And we do. And for fan creators, we want to be a part of it so badly that we're willing to make more of it, not for profit, but for sheer love. And for early writers, the newbies, the blossoming beginners, Mary Sue's are where they generally start, because those are the sorts of stories they've been telling themselves for years already. But as we get older, as we consume more media texts and find more things to adore, we begin to notice a dearth of representation. We're not pony trains anymore. We have a better idea of what we look like, and we don't see it. The glorious fantasy diversity of our childhoods is stripped away, narratives are codified by the mainstream media texts we consume, and people stop looking like us. I'm reminded of a story on Tumblr of a young Black author living in Africa, whose name I'm afraid I wasn't able to find when I went searching for it, so my apologies to her. The story is about the first time she tried to write a fairy tale in elementary school. She made her protagonist a little white girl, and when she was asked why she hadn't chosen to make the protagonist Black, this author realized that it hadn't even occurred to her that she was allowed to make the protagonist Black. Even though she was surrounded by people of color, the adventures and romance and magic and everything she consumed only happened to white folks. She did not know that she was allowed to make herself and people like her the heroes, because she'd never seen it. This is not natural. This is nurture, not nature. This is learned behavior. This is hegemony. No child grows up believing that they don't have a place in the story. This is something we're taught, and this is something that we are taught by the media texts we consume. Now, I do want to pause and make a point here. There isn't anything fundamentally wrong with writing a narrative from the heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical white cis male POV in and of itself. I think we all have stories that we know and love that feature that particular flavor of protagonist. And people from that community deserve to tell their stories as much as folks from any other community. The problem comes from a reality where it's the only narrative, where it's the default narrative, where it's the factory setting. When people who don't see themselves reflected in narrative nonetheless feel obliged to write stories, these stories, instead of their own stories, when they're told and taught that that kind of story is the only story worth telling. There's this really great essay by Ika Willis called Keeping Promises to Queer Children, Making Room for Mary Sue at Hogwarts. And I think it's one of the most important pieces of writing, not only on Mary Sue's, but on the dire need for representation in general. In the essay, Willis talks about Mary Sue's beyond being masturbatory adventure avatars for young people just coming into their own sexuality, or as avatars to go on adventures with, but as voice avatars. Mary Sue's, when wielded with self-awareness, deliberateness, and precision, can force a wedge into the narrative, can crack it open to provide a space for the marginalized identities and voices in a media text that otherwise are silenced and ignored. This is done in one of two ways. First, by jamming in a diverse Mary Sue and making the characters or the world acknowledge that work and work with that diversity. And second, by co-opting a pre-existing character and overlaying a new identity on them while retaining their essential characterization. for example, by writing a story where Bilbo Baggins is non-binary but still thinks that adventures are messy, dirty things, or one where Sherlock Holmes is deaf but still perfectly capable of solving all of the crimes, or making James Potter Indian so that the Dursleys' prejudice against Harry was not only for his magic but also for his skin color, or making Ariel the mermaid wrestle with severe body dysmorphia, or Commander Shepard suffer from severe PTSD. I like to call this voice avatar Mary Sue a meta-Sue, because when authors have evolved enough in their storytelling abilities to consciously deploy Mary Sues as a deliberate trope, they're doing so on a self-aware, metatextual level. Meta-Sue. So that's where Mary Sues come from. But what is a Mary Sue? Can you point at a character and say, yes, that definitively is a Mary Sue? Sure. Mary Sues can be characterized as too perfect or unrealistically skilled. They shouldn't be able to do all the things they do or know all the things they know as easily as they do or know them. For reasons of the plot expedience, they learn too fast and are able to perform feats that other characters in their world who have studied or trained longer and harder find difficult. For example, Neo in the Matrix. 2. They are the black hole of every plot. Every major quest or goal of the pre-existing characters warps to include or be about them. Every character wants to befriend them, or romance them, or sleep with them, and every villain wants to possess them, or kill them, or sleep with them. This makes sense as why write a character into the world if you're not going to have something very important happen to them. So, for example, like Neo in the Matrix. A Mary Sue because she's written by a neophyte author who's been taught that characters need flaws, has some sort of melodramatic, angsty, tragic backstory that, while on the surface seems to motivate them into action, because of lack of experience in creating a follow-through of emotional motivation, doesn't actually affect their mental health or ability to trust or to be happy or in love. So, like, for example, Neo in the Matrix. The Mary Sue saves the day. This goes back to the impulse to be the center of the story, like Neo in the Matrix. And lastly, Mary Sues come from outside the group. They're from the real world, like you or I, or have somehow discovered the hero's secret identity and must be folded into the team, or are a new recruit, or are a sort of previously undiscovered standalone chosen one, like, for example, Neo in the Matrix. Now, as I've said, there's nothing inherently wrong with writing a Mary Sue. Yeah, Neo is a Mary Sue, but the Matrix is still a really engaging and well-written film. And simply by virtue of the fact that an individual with ingrained cultural foundations is writing the story, that story is inherently rooted in that writer's lived life and experiences. As much as a writer may try to either highlight or downplay it, each character and story they create has some of themselves in it. The first impulse of storytelling is to talk about oneself. We write about ourselves, only the more we write, the more skilled we become at disguising the sliver of usness in a character, folding it into something different and unique. We, as storytellers, as humans, empathize with protagonists and fictional characters constantly. We love putting our feet into other people's shoes. It's how we understand and engage with the world. And we as writers tap into our own emotions in order to describe them on the page. We take slices of our lives, our experiences, our memories, our friends' verbal tics or hand gestures, Aunt Brenda's way of making tea, Uncle Rudy's way of having a pipe after dinner, that time Granny got lost at the zoo, and we weave them together into a golem that we call a character, which comes to life with a bit of literary magic. I mean, allow me to be sparklingly reductionist here for a second, but in the most basic sense, every character, ever created, is a Mary Sue. It's just a matter of whether the writer has evolved to the point in their craft where they've learned to animate that golem with the sliver of selfness hidden deep enough that it's unrecognizable as selfness, but still recognizable as humanness. For years, mainstream Western media has featured characters who were primarily heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical white cis males, and regrettably, because of that, this flavor of human is now assumed to be the default for a character. When people from other communities speak up requesting other flavors for characters for whom the embedded sliver of humanity remains just as poignant and relatable, but the outer shell is of a different variety. This is when that certain segment of the fan population loses their cool. That certain segment of the fan population has been telling us for years that if we don't like what we see on TV or video games or books or comics or on the stage, that we should just go and make our own stuff. So now we are. Make your own stuff, they say. And then they follow it up with, ugh, what's with all this queer stuff? What's with all this black stuff? What's with all this political correctness gone wild? Ugh, this stuff is all just Mary Sue garbage. Well, yes, of course it is. That's the point. But why are they saying it like that? Because they mean it in a derogatory sense. They don't mean it the way that Paula Smith meant it, a little bit belittling, but mostly fun, a bemused celebration of why we love putting ourselves into the stories and the worlds we enjoy. They don't mean it in the way that Willis means it, a deliberate and knowing way to shove the previously marginalized into the center. They don't even mean it the way that I mean it in my own work, as a tool for carefully deconstructing and discussing character and narrative with a character from within a narrative. When a certain segment of the fan population talks about the Mary Sue, they mean to weaponize it. To make it a stand-in for the worst thing that a character can be. Bland, predictable, and too perfect. Which, granted, many Mary Sues are, but not all of them. And a character doesn't have to be a Mary Sue to be done badly. When this certain segment of a fan population says Mary Sue, they're trying to shame the creators for deviating from the norm. The white, the heterosexual, the able-bodied, the neurotypical, the cis male. When this certain segment of the population says Mary Sue, what they're really saying is, I don't believe people like this are interesting enough to be the center of a story. When this certain segment of the fan population says Mary Sue, what they're really saying is, I don't think there's any need to listen to that voice. They're not interesting enough. When a certain segment of the population says Mary Sue, what they're saying is, this character is not what I'm used to, aka not like me, and I'm gonna whine about it. When this certain segment of the population says Mary Sue, what they're really saying is, even though kids from all over the world, from many different cultural, religious, and ethnic backgrounds, have had to grow up learning to identify with characters who don't look or think like them, identifying with characters who don't look or think like me is hard, and I don't wanna. When this certain segment of the population says Mary Sue, what they're saying is, even though I've grown up in a position of privilege and power, and even though publishing and producing diverse stories with diverse casts does not actually cut into the proportionate representation that I receive and never will, I am nonetheless scared that I'll never see people like me in media texts ever again. When this certain segment of the population says Mary Sue, what they're saying is, considering my fellow human beings as fellow human beings worthy of having stories about them and their own experiences told in their own voices is hard, and I don't want them. When this certain segment of the population says Mary Sue, what they're really saying is, I only want stories about me. They call leads Mary Sues so people will stop writing them and instead write, well, their version of a Mary Sue. The character that is representative of their lived experiences, their power, their masturbatory fantasies, their physical appearances, their sexual awakenings, their cultural identity, their voice, and their kind of narratives. Missing, of course, that the point of a revisionist and inclusive narratives aren't to shove out previous incarnations, but to coexist alongside them. It's not taking away one entree and only offering one other. It's building a buffet. Okay. So who actually cares if these trolls call these diverse characters Mary Sues anyway? Well, unfortunately, because this certain segment of the population have traditionally been the group most listened to by the mainstream media creators and the big money, their opinions have power. Never mind that they're not actually the biggest group of consumers anymore, nor longer the most vocal. So, this is where you come in. You have the power to take the Mary Sue from the edge of the narrative and put her back into the center. And you can do this by normalizing it. Think back to that author who didn't think little black girls were allowed to be the heroes of fairy tales. Now imagine how much different her inner world, her imagination might have been at the stage when she was first learning to understand her self-worth if she had seen faces like hers on the television, in comics, in games, and on the written page every day of her life. And not just one or two heroes, but a broad spectrum of characters that run the gamut from hero to villain, from fragile to powerful, from straight to gay, and every other kind of intersectional identity. You have the power to give children the ability to see themselves. Multifaceted representation normalizes the marginalized. And if you have the privilege to be part of the passing member of the mainstream, then weaponize your privilege. Refuse to work with publishers or websites or conventions that don't also support diverse creators. Put diverse characters in your own work and do so thoughtfully and with the input of the people from the community you are portraying. And if you're given the opportunity to submit or speak at an event, share the microphone. The first thing I did when actor Bern Gorman got a Twitter account was to tweet to him my thanks for saving the world in Pacific Rim while on a cane. As someone who isn't as mobile as the heroes I see in action films, and who knows for a fact that when the zombie apocalypse comes, I will not be able to outrun the monsters, it meant so much to me that this character was not only an integral and vital member of the team who canceled the apocalypse, but also, not once in the film, did someone call him a cripple, or tell him that he couldn't participate, or leave him behind, and the film's narrative didn't magically cure him at any point. Diversity matters. Not because it's a trending hashtag or a way to sell media text to a lockdown niche market, but because every single human being deserves to be told that they have a voice worth listening to, a life worth celebrating and showcasing in a narrative, a reality worth acknowledging and accepting and protecting, emotions that are worth exploring and validating, intelligence that is worth investing in and listening to, and a capacity to love that is worth adoring. White, heterosexual, neurotypical, able-bodied cis males are not the only people on the planet who are human. And you have a right to tell your story your way. Calling something a Mary Sue in order to dismiss it out of hand as an excuse to hate something before even seeing it is how the trolls bury your narrative and your identity. We are storytellers. All of us. Every person out there. Whatever your wheelhouse is, whether it's fiction or academia or narrative nonfiction or social media, we impart knowledge and offer experience through the written word, through the telling of tales, through leading the reader from one thought to another. And we none of us deserve to be shouted down, talked over, or dismissed. No one can tell you that your story isn't worth telling. Of course it is. It's yours. And don't let anyone call your characters or your work or you a Mary Sue in the derogatory sense ever again. Or I am going to scream.